Keanu Reeves walked into a big office building wearing an old, faded hoodie and a baseball cap. To most people in the room, he didn't look like someone who belonged there. He looked like a man who had stepped off the wrong elevator and ended up on the wrong floor. One of the executives in the room, not recognizing him, asked him to leave. Keanu didn't argue though. He didn't get upset or defensive. He simply sat down and waited. Then, quietly, he said one simple sentence that made the executive realize her mistake. The truth was revealed slowly and calmly. After Keanu spoke, the silence that followed was louder than any speech that had come before. It was as if everything in the room had stopped for a moment, realizing that they had just witnessed something that couldn't be undone. Before we get into the story more, let's take a moment. Where are you watching this from? Where do you live? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love to know where our listeners and readers are from. Now let's get back to the story. It was a busy morning in New York City. The streets were alive with movement. Yellow cabs sped down the roads, cutting corners like they owned the city. The sounds of espresso machines hissing could be heard through the windows of cafes, and the sidewalks were crowded with people rushing around as if everyone in the city was running late for something. At the corner of 47th and Park, just outside a small cafe with foggy windows and a chalkboard menu listing the day's specials, stood a man. He was strangely calm compared to the rush of people moving around him. The man wore a hoodie that was zipped halfway up, its fabric soft and worn from use. His jeans were dark and slightly faded, his sneakers were old and worn down, and his navy baseball cap was low on his head, hiding most of his face. The cap had seen many days and had creases folded into it, like it had a story to tell. Keanu Reeves, because yes, it was him, stood there holding a steaming cup of black coffee. His fingers wrapped around the cup, tightening slightly as he enjoyed the warmth. His eyes, though, were not focused on anything in particular. He was just observing the way someone might look at a painting they've seen many times before. They don't search for anything specific but always find something new in it. As he stood there, Keanu instinctively moved aside to make room for an elderly woman using a walker, trying to pass him on the sidewalk. He made sure she could get by without any trouble. But just as he moved to the side, the door to the cafe swung open behind him, and a woman's fast, clicking heels filled the air. The woman was in a rush, and before Keanu could even turn around, she collided with him. The coffee in his hand splashed out in a perfect arc through the air and landed all over the woman's expensive outfit, a blush pink blazer and a cream silk blouse. The coffee splattered across her jacket, soaking it with dark liquid. The woman gasped and looked at the stain with a mixture of shock and anger. "Are you kidding me?" she demanded, staring at her ruined jacket. Keanu, taken off guard, stepped back slightly and apologized. "I'm sorry. I didn't see you." But the woman didn't care. She looked down at her silk jacket and shouted, "Oh my God, this is silk. Do you even know what that means?" She glared at him, eyes sharp with judgment. "Of course you don't," she added bitterly. Keanu, trying to make things right, offered her a napkin from his back pocket, but she didn't take it. She didn't even look at it. "Do you always stand in the middle of the sidewalk holding hot drinks like a lost tourist?" the woman asked, her voice filled with sarcasm. She quickly scanned him up and down, noticing that he wasn't dressed in fancy clothes like everyone else. "Let me guess," she continued, her words sharp. "You're just here delivering something or hanging around until someone pays you to leave, right?" Keanu didn't respond in the way most people would have. He didn't get defensive. He didn't argue with her or try to explain himself. He simply held her gaze, calm and steady but not confrontational. He explained, "I was letting someone pass behind me. I didn't expect anyone to come running from the side." The woman, not satisfied with his calm response, laughed once, the sound short and sharp. "Right," she said as though she didn't believe him. "My fault for walking like someone who actually has somewhere important to be." She looked again at the stain on her jacket, which had started to dry into the fabric, making it dark and unforgiving. With a sigh, she pulled a silk scarf from her bag and tried to dab at the coffee stain. It didn't help though. The stain was too big and it wasn't going anywhere. "Here's some advice," she said coolly, trying to put him in his place. "Next time you come to Midtown dressed like that, try not to spill on people who actually belong here." Keanu, still calm, let the silence sit for a moment before responding. "Hope your meeting goes better than your morning," he said politely. The woman tilted her head slightly, surprised by his calm response. It wasn't the reaction she was expecting. She wanted to have the last word, but Keanu had already taken the power from her. With a huff, she tossed the napkin into a nearby trash can, turned and walked away, straightening her jacket as she did so. Keanu didn't watch her go. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee and set the cup down next to a planter. He looked up at the tall glass building in front of him. A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smug smile, but it was knowing. He knew that the worst thing that would happen to Victoria Fletcher that day hadn't even started yet. The marble lobby of Eris & Co. was grand and cold, like the inside of a cathedral. The floors were shiny and smooth, and everything smelled like money, new carpets, fresh coffee, and the faint scent of designer perfume left behind by the people walking through. Keanu walked through the revolving doors and was immediately lost in the blur of people rushing by. They were all busy, carrying briefcases or badges, all walking like they had something important to do. Keanu didn't stand out at all. He didn't try to look special or important. He moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, blending in perfectly. A security guard behind the reception desk looked up and did a double take when he saw Keanu. "Excuse me, sir," the guard asked. "Are you looking for someone?" Keanu calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It had a name and a barcode on it, nothing more. The guard scanned the paper and the scanner beeped. There was a moment of silence, and then the light on the scanner turned green. The guard's posture immediately changed. "You're good to go," he said. "Elevators to the left, top floor." Keanu nodded politely and walked away. He didn't notice the puzzled look on the guard's face as he left. In the elevator, a woman in a navy skirt and glasses looked at him. She leaned toward the man beside her and whispered, "He looks just like Keanu Reeves." The man snorted, "Yeah, right? There's no way someone like that walks around alone." Keanu stepped off the elevator alone and walked into the executive wing of the building. The quiet, cold rooms were a world apart from the busy streets of New York. Voices here were soft and polite, and the chairs in this room cost more than most people's monthly rent. Keanu stepped into the conference room, and the real story was just beginning. The long table was shiny and surrounded by black leather chairs. The room was full of people rushing around, getting ready for the 9 a.m. meeting with a new investor who was rumored to be coming. At the center of it all stood Victoria Fletcher. She was wearing a blazer over her stained blouse, and a silk scarf was covering most of the stains. Victoria was giving orders like a boss, making everything happen just the way she wanted. "I want the projection screens up in 5 minutes," she shouted. "The flow of the meeting has to be perfect. And where's the catering? Don't let anyone put croissants with the savory trays. I swear if I see carbs next to prosciutto again." Just then the doors opened and a man named Keanu walked in. When he entered, everything seemed to freeze. A young intern by the printer stopped walking, and a junior manager almost dropped her tablet. Victoria turned around, saw him, and stiffened like a cat spotting a rat. "You," she said loudly. "What are you doing here?" Keanu looked around the room quietly, not acting important, but curious. "I have a meeting," he said simply. Victoria raised an eyebrow and stepped forward, looking like she was about to tell him to leave. "With who?" she asked. "This floor is only for top bosses and investors. You're neither." Some people in the room shifted uncomfortably and whispers started. Keanu didn't react. "I was invited," he said calmly. "Invited by whom?" Victoria asked. "Your reflection?" A few people in the room snickered quietly. One young man, wearing a checkered blazer, whispered to his neighbor, "He really looks like Keanu Reeves." His neighbor replied, "Even if it was him, why would he be here? We're talking business, not signing autographs." Victoria, still not convinced, crossed her arms and gave Keanu a fake smile. "I think you're in the wrong boardroom, mister." Keanu looked at her calmly and said, "Let's just say I'm here to listen." But before Victoria could respond, the doors opened again and a man in a suit walked in. He was important looking and carried himself like someone who handled huge amounts of money. This man was Victor Langdon, the senior partner in charge of the company's buyout deal. He stopped when he saw Keanu, then smiled and said warmly, "Mr. Reeves, I'm glad you could make it. We're right on time." Victoria's jaw didn't actually drop, but it looked like it might. The whole room became silent. Keanu smiled back. "Morning, Victor." For a long moment, no one said anything. Victoria's eyes were locked on Victor, hoping that she had heard wrong, that he didn't just call the man in the doorway Mr. Reeves. But it was true. Victor walked over to Keanu and shook his hand. He then motioned to the table like he was welcoming a guest. "We've got everything ready," Victor said. "Let's get you settled before we start." Keanu nodded politely and pulled out a chair. He didn't sit at the head of the table, but close enough that everyone had to notice him. The atmosphere in the room suddenly felt different. People shifted in their seats. One intern secretly pulled out her phone and started searching for Keanu Reeves' investor Valeris rumor. Victoria wasn't so easily shaken. She walked toward Victor with a tight smile, like she was about to fix a mistake. "Sorry, Victor, did you say Mr. Reeves? As in Keanu Reeves, the actor?" Victor looked up from his tablet, calm and unconcerned. "Yes, Victoria, that Keanu Reeves. He's the main person behind the group that's buying us out." Victoria's voice went a little higher. "Wait, he's the investor?" "That's right," Victor confirmed. Victoria looked back at Keanu like she was trying to figure him out. Her face said one thing, but her eyes said something else, like she was trying to match his face to the idea of a celebrity. Then she suddenly laughed too loudly, trying to cover up her surprise. "Well, this is unexpected," she said. Keanu just looked at her, not angry or proud, just calm. "Yes," he said quietly. "I've heard that a lot lately." Victor didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. "Mr. Reeves is here to observe how Valeris works from the inside," he said. "He asked to sit in today without any announcement. So, please continue the meeting as you normally would." Everyone could feel the weight of those words. Victoria's face stayed still, but her eyes showed something different. She nodded and quickly turned to the screen at the front of the room. "Of course, let's begin," she said, though her voice was still sharp and focused. The lights dimmed and a sleek presentation appeared on the screen. Victoria began her pitch, her voice confident again. "What Valeris needs," she said, "isn't just money. We need discipline and leadership that knows when to make tough choices. We need to raise our image and make sure everything we do shows power, polish, and precision." Keanu sat quietly, hands folded in front of him, not showing any emotion. She clicked to the next slide, showing an organizational chart. "There are too many managers who don't do enough work," she continued. "The communications department is too big, and we're not aligned with the image we want to show." She glanced at Keanu for a brief moment, but quickly turned away. "I'm talking about standards," she said. "We need to make sure that when someone walks into this company, whether they're a client, a partner, or the press, they see a culture of excellence." She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what she meant. Not people like him. The room was quiet. Even Victor stopped looking at his tablet. Keanu didn't react at all. Victoria cleared her throat, clicked again, and continued. "Our media strategy will focus on revitalizing the brand through sleek images, careful press interactions, and protecting who we align ourselves with." She didn't look at Keanu this time. When she finished, there was a short, unsure applause. Victor nodded politely. The room felt very quiet afterward. Then someone from the legal team, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a nervous pen, raised her hand. "Mr. Reeves," she asked, "would you like to share any thoughts?" All eyes were on Keanu. The room was quiet, so quiet that you could almost hear the air moving. Everyone held their breath as he leaned forward. No rush, no tension. He took his time, looking at Victoria first, then glancing down at the table in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was calm and soft, but his words were clear and filled with meaning. "I really like it when leaders are clear. I appreciate clarity," he said. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before continuing. "But sometimes people confuse clarity with control. And control is not the same as having character." His words hung in the air, light but heavy, like they carried a deeper message. Victoria's hand tightened around the laser pointer she had been using to click through the slides. The room didn't make a sound. It felt like time itself had stopped. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but still very present. "That's all," he added with a calm smile, almost like he was done with the conversation, but the message had already been sent. The meeting continued, but something was different. The charts on the screen changed and voices began to speak again, but the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, but as the meeting wore on, the change was hard to ignore. It was like the temperature had dropped just a little, but no one said anything. Victoria stood at the screen, her posture still perfect, eyes flicking between bullet points on the slides. But now her voice was different. It was still clear, but it didn't have the same fire or passion that it usually did. It felt rehearsed, like she was just going through the motions, speaking words that didn't land as strongly as they used to. Keanu hadn't argued with her, hadn't raised his voice, or even corrected her. But somehow, just by speaking a few sentences, he made her realize something she hadn't thought about before. She wasn't the most powerful voice in the room anymore. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Across the table, Dylan Patel, the senior vice president of product development, who usually kept quiet during these kinds of meetings, leaned forward in his chair. He hadn't been taking notes during the last few meetings, but now he was. He was writing something down, paying close attention to what was happening. Claire Lee, the marketing director, glanced at Keanu, then at Victoria. She raised an eyebrow and gave him a small, almost knowing smile. The intern who had been pretending to take notes was no longer writing. Instead, he was quietly Googling Keanu Reeves under the table, clearly more interested in the man than in the meeting itself. Victoria continued to speak, her voice still controlled. Our international strategy is focused on expanding our brand identity into emerging tech platforms, she said. We aim to form curated partnerships to maintain control over our messaging and brand equity. She delivered the words smoothly, but there was something off about them now. The energy wasn't there. She wasn't convincing anyone. And Keanu, sitting across from her, said nothing. He just watched, his eyes never leaving her. After a moment, Dylan spoke up. Your plan is solid, Victoria, he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. But maybe it's a bit too focused on image. In this climate, people care about authenticity. Victoria blinked, surprised by his words. She had always believed that controlling how people saw them was the key to success. But Dylan was challenging that. We used to pride ourselves on being real at Valeris, he continued. We weren't curated. We were trusted. The room went still again. Victoria's smile flickered, and she felt a little uncomfortable. Claire then added, Actually, I think Dylan has a point. If we start focusing too much on how glossy our brand looks, we might alienate the very voices we want to elevate. Keanu, still watching, nodded slightly, his gaze never leaving Victoria. She stepped back from the screen slowly, the remote still in her hand. She tried to gather her thoughts, but the pressure was mounting. Let me be clear, she said, trying to regain control. This isn't about silencing voices. It's about shaping how we appear to the world. Her words were carefully chosen, her tone measured. Keanu's voice cut through the room like a knife. There is a difference, he said softly. Victoria paused, feeling the weight of his words. But when shaping becomes shaving, soon there's nothing left to recognize or respect. His words weren't just for her. They were for the entire room, but they felt louder to Victoria than anyone else. A heavy silence followed. Victoria realized then what had changed. She was no longer the strongest voice in the room. She wasn't the one people were listening to anymore. It wasn't just what Keanu had said, it was the way he had said it. His quiet confidence had shifted the energy in the room in ways she hadn't expected. The silence after his words wasn't empty, it was full of thoughts, full of doubt. Victoria could feel it. She excused herself from the meeting, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked down the corridor. The sound of her footsteps echoed, and it felt like she was trying to outrun her own thoughts, trying to escape the feeling of losing control. She entered the executive lounge and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Her scarf was still perfectly knotted, her makeup still flawless, and her blazer still neatly pressed. But something inside her felt like it was slipping. She wasn't sure what it was, but she could feel it. She gripped the edge of the sink, her fingers tightening. Control the optics, she whispered to herself. Own the narrative. But she knew deep down that the narrative had already shifted. Keanu had changed it in just 2 sentences, and she didn't know how to take it back. In the hallway, the whispers had started. 2 managers were talking near the coffee station. That was Keanu Reeves, right? One of them asked. I heard his name was on the acquisition documents, the other replied. You mean Keanu Reeves just bought Valeris? They laughed, but it wasn't a cruel laugh. It was more like curiosity, like they were intrigued by the idea. There was no fear or mockery, just wonder. Victoria re-entered the hallway, and the first thing she noticed was how everything looked normal on the outside. People greeted her as usual, but there was something different in their eyes. It wasn't defiance. It was uncertain. And that uncertainty bothered Victoria more than anything else. She had always been the one people looked to, the one they listened to. But now she was starting to feel like she was optional, not inevitable. When she stepped back into the conference room, the change was impossible to ignore. No one leaned forward eagerly when she spoke. No one looked at her with the same attention or respect. The moment she sat down, she saw the difference. Even Victor Langdon, who was supposed to be her ally, glanced at Keanu before speaking. The room had shifted. It wasn't hers anymore. Keanu hadn't moved. He was still sitting quietly, his hands folded, watching everything unfold. Victoria had to do something. She had to take back control. With the laser pointer still in her hand, she turned away from the screen and faced Keanu. Mr. Reeves, she began, her voice a perfect mix of charm and challenge. Since you're now in the room not just as an observer, but as a principal investor, it might be helpful for all of us to hear your thoughts directly. I'm sure the team would appreciate clarity on your vision. Her tone was polite, but there was a challenge behind her words. She wasn't offering him the floor. She was daring him to take it. The room felt tense, like everyone was holding their breath. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and a few executives looked nervous. They knew what Victoria was doing. They knew she was trying to force Keanu to speak, to take back control. But Keanu didn't budge. He sat there, calm and still, like he already knew exactly how this meeting would play out. Keanu looked at her for a long time. Then, without saying anything, he reached for the glass of water in front of him. He drank it slowly. The room was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it felt important, like the cold air on a very clear day. "I find it interesting," he said, setting the glass down carefully, "how often people think talking means you're a leader." Victoria smiled, but her shoulders became a little tense. Keanu leaned forward, not to be mean, but with a serious look. "I've been listening. I've seen the numbers. I've heard the plans," he said. He looked at everyone around the table. "But I haven't heard anyone ask about people. Not the market. Not the strategy. People," he said. He didn't look at Victoria when he said this, but he didn't need to. This company was built on being creative, on telling stories, and on understanding things that weren't said out loud. Keanu paused for a second and then said, "Somewhere along the way we started caring more about how things look than about what they really mean." The room was quiet. No one said anything right away. The air felt different now. One of the interns dropped her pen, but no one picked it up. Keanu leaned back, his voice steady. "If we really want Valeris to matter, then maybe we should stop acting like we're scared to be real with each other." Everyone seemed to exhale at the same time. Victoria stood frozen, holding a pointer in her hand, but the screen behind her was black now. The room was still, not in an awkward way but in a way that made everyone think. Victoria wasn't in charge anymore. For the first time she could feel it. Keanu had taken over, but not with shouting or making rules. He had done it quietly, just by speaking with respect. Victoria didn't say anything at first. She just stood there trying to think of what to say next. "Shall we move to the final part of the discussion?" she said, but her voice didn't sound as strong anymore. Victor cleared his throat and said, "We could, or maybe we let our new partner talk about his plans." Victoria's head turned just a little. She didn't like that Victor had said that. But Claire, always calm and professional, spoke softly from a few seats away. "I'd like to hear what kind of leadership Keanu thinks is important," she said. Dylan added, "Yeah, especially after what we just heard. We've seen the slides, but we haven't heard the direction yet." No one looked at Victoria now. That was the moment. No one raised their hands or voted. But everyone's eyes and voices had shifted. It was like they had quietly decided who they trusted more, and it wasn't Victoria anymore. Victoria tried to speak again. "Well, to be clear, the plan I showed," but Keanu spoke first, not louder, just before her. "I'm not here to replace good work," he said. "I'm here to make sure the work really matters." Those words hit harder than anything Victoria had prepared. Keanu turned toward Victor. "I'll need 48 hours to review things like company culture, the work we're doing, and how we communicate," he said. "After that, I'll suggest some changes." Victor nodded. Keanu looked around the room, not as a famous person or a guest, but like a leader. "I don't expect everyone to agree with me," he said, "but I do expect honesty. And I hope that by the time I'm done listening, you'll all be honest with each other." A few people nodded. Others stayed still, but it didn't mean the same thing anymore. Victoria stepped back, not because she was scared, but because she knew something had changed. For the first time in her career, she had just seen someone take over without raising their voice, without giving orders. The meeting ended. It wasn't anything special. Laptops were closed, people shook hands, and the slides were forgotten. But as Victoria walked out of the conference room, she didn't feel like it was over. She felt like she had been pushed out. She didn't wait for the elevator. She took the stairs, breathing fast and holding the steel rail with one hand. Her other hand gripped her phone tightly. She needed to talk to Victor. She needed to make him understand, to take back control. When she reached her office, she slammed the door and called him. He answered on the second ring. "Victoria?" he said, calm as always. "Don't Victoria me," she snapped. "Why didn't you tell me Keanu was the buyer?" There was a pause. "I thought you knew," Victor said. "You thought?" Victoria repeated, her steps sharp as she paced. "Do you know how it looked in there? How did it felt to be left out? To be surprised by a man who's known for movies, not business?" Victor wasn't annoyed, just not surprised. "Keanu isn't here because of his fame," he said. "He's here because he understands what's important. Value, culture, and, more importantly, he owns 79% of the company." Victoria felt her chest tighten. What? What do you mean it's already done? Victor's voice didn't change. It's signed, filed, and transferred. As of this morning. Victoria gripped her chair. No vote? No board review. There was a vote, Victor said. You just weren't in the room. The silence that followed was heavy. Victoria's mind raced. She thought about how she could fix this. Appeal to the board, use PR, call her allies. But she knew deep down there were no allies left. She sat down slowly. Her hands were still shaking even though they looked fine on the outside. She had built her life on control, on making people listen to her. But now, when it mattered most, no one listened. They had quietly turned to Keanu instead. Do you think he's going to run this place? She asked. You think a man who came in dressed like no one can lead? Victor's voice didn't change. He already is. And with that he hung up. Victoria sat in silence. She looked at her hands. They were still perfect, still manicured. But they were shaking just a little. Outside the lights began to dim. The buildings outside glimmered in the fading light of the day. Victoria quietly walked back into the executive wing. This time she wasn't wearing heels, just flats she kept in her drawer for long days. Today felt longer than most. She wasn't there to fight. She wasn't there to argue. She was just there to grab her planner and tablet. But as she reached the conference room, she heard voices from inside. They weren't loud. It sounded calm, like people who were comfortable with each other. Victoria peeked inside. There were only a few people left in the room: Victor, Claire, Dylan, and Keanu. No slides. No screens. Just talking. Keanu wasn't giving a speech. He wasn't telling people what to do. He was listening. And then when he spoke, he didn't try to be the boss. He was just talking to them calmly like they were equals. We don't need to rush, Keanu was saying. Good culture doesn't come from fixing problems. It comes from owning them. From people feeling like they matter. The others nodded. Claire added something and Dylan laughed softly. Victoria just stood outside the door, not part of the meeting. No one asked her to join. No one even thought to. For the first time, she realized she wasn't needed in the room. It wasn't because she wasn't invited, but because no one thought of her at all. The room had moved on without her, without anger or celebration. Just like that, the meeting had gone on without her. Victoria backed away slowly, her reflection in the glass looking like a ghost. The hallway felt colder now. She didn't cry or shout. She didn't try to call anyone. She just walked, her shoes quiet on the marble floor. She stepped into the elevator without a word. As the doors closed, she saw the conference room one last time, the place that didn't belong to her anymore. And she understood what Keanu had meant when he said, "Control isn't leadership. Leadership isn't noise." In a world that loves noise and being loud, it's easy to think that silence means weakness, and being humble means you're not important. But true strength doesn't need to be seen. It just shows up, calm and steady, and doesn't care about getting attention. Keanu didn't try to show off. He didn't talk louder than anyone else. He just listened, and when the time came, he spoke not to hurt anyone, but to remind them that real respect isn't about what you wear or how loud you talk. It's about what you do. Victoria lost her power because somewhere along the way she stopped listening to people. She stopped seeing them for who they really were. And when she looked around, no one was standing with her anymore. So remember, don't let how you look or how loud you are be more important than your integrity. Don't think being seen is the same as being valuable. And don't ever think that the quiet person in the corner doesn't already own the room, because sometimes they do. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next video.